as a focus on the transmission of leadership from Moses to Joshua. Joshua is a name that we know. There's actually a book called the Book of Joshua. How many of you read it? Yeah, a few, right? Joshua is just not a book that is studied that often because it's really kind of boring. It's a story about how Joshua led the people in the conquering of the land. It has a few good things in it, but most people skip it and go straight to the book of Judges because it has a lot of better stories. And Joshua has not played a major role in Jewish history. His name is known, but there's not a lot of focus on him. So I wanted to do that for this moment, particularly the transfer of leadership from Moses to Joshua. Again, Cecil B. DeMille got it right. He made Joshua into a major character because in the Torah he is a transitional character. And our eldest son, realizing how Joshua had been ignored, did his PhD on the book of Joshua. And because nobody else did, within 6 months after finishing the PhD, the thesis, it was published because it was groundbreaking. People had ignored Joshua for a very long period of time. But the relationship between Moses and Joshua is what I want to focus on. It's a very special one. For 40 years, they lived together, master and disciple. Whatever Moses commanded, Joshua did. When they left Egypt, remember the Amalekites attacked the people of Israel. Moses orders Joshua to choose soldiers and go to war against them with no ifs, no buts, no hesitations, no questions. Joshua, the loyal general, obeys. He goes out to war, and he wins. Moses ordered that this first Jewish military victory be recorded in the annals of Jewish history, so it's right there in the Torah. Elie Wiesel, the late Elie Wiesel, suggested maybe the reason it's recorded in the Torah is because the Jews have won so few military victories that it is worth recording each and every one of them. Later on, the Bible said something about Moses that is said of no other human being. It says of him, God spoke to Moses as one speaks to a friend face to face. That phrase about Moses is well known, but the second half of the verse is less well known. It says this, and his servant Joshua never moved from the tent of Moses. So Moses is talking to God like a friend face to face, and Joshua sits at the tent outside and won't budge until his master exits, and then he can follow him. We get a picture of this man who is there, always there, unobtrusively there, in the background, but always there. When Moses spoke to the tribes, when Moses spoke to God, when Moses was alone with his thoughts, Joshua was ever present, ever on call, available if needed, never intrusive, never disturbing, but there, always there. So when Joshua went out to spy the land, remember he's one of the 12 spies, Moses gave him a blessing by changing his name from Hoshea to Yehoshua. We only know him as Yehoshua, Joshua. We don't know him as Hoshea. But that was his original name. And what does it mean? May God protect you. So the rabbis say that Moses said that he was sending his faithful servant and his friend into a double danger. Danger from the people whose land he was going to spy out, but danger from the scouts with whom he was going. Moses suspected the other scouts were not ever there, ever loyal, ever present, only Joshua. Moses loved Joshua, so he prayed for him. He gave him this name as a blessing. He understood the double danger that he faced. Joshua came back safe from both dangers, unafraid of the people of the land, uncorrupted by the people with whom he traveled. He brought back the minority report with Caleb, 2 against 10. He was outvoted, he was not listened to, but he held his ground. From him, we can learn how to be a minority, to take a stand against the crowd if we must. That's what Joshua did. And then in this week's portion, there comes God's decree that Moses won't enter the land. Moses' first reaction is not to cry, not to plead, not to beg, not to protest. He'll do that later. But his first reaction is to ask, who will take my place? Who will take care of this people? His first worry was about his people. And God tells him, choose Joshua. Ish asher ruach bo. This is a person, Joshua, who has the right spirit within him. Appoint him as your successor. So Moses is asked to do the hardest thing that anyone who has ever tasted power can be asked to do, to let go of power, to turn over the reins of leadership to someone else. We see how hard that is. Look around the world, right? We see leaders who are serving their 18th year of their 4-year term, right? Who never stepped out, who are now for life, leaders for life. That wasn't Moses. He did it sincerely, graciously, with a whole heart. He didn't do it reluctantly, grudgingly, or with resentment. There's a nuance in the text that contains the answer. He was told to take Joshua and bring him before the Kohen and before the people and put his hand on him. He was only commanded to put one hand upon him. But you know what the text says? Moses put his hands upon him in order to show that with a full heart, completely, without hesitation, he was turning over the leadership to him. No resentment, no conditions. A whole and happy heart. He did it in front of the entire nation. So it's not a small thing that Moses does here. Anyone who's ever built a business and had to turn it over to someone else, anyone who held power over a community and then had to let it go, knows that this is a difficult test that a person can go through. Many a person we know has failed that last test, could not hand over the reins of power in the family. You saw that. You ever see Succession? It's an amazing series. You got to see it. That's what it's about. As I saw Succession, I said, oh, he should have read the stuff about Moses and Joshua because he's getting it wrong. Moses did not fail the test. But imagine how Joshua must have felt that day, knowing that his rise to power was to be at the cost of his master's life because Moses would go to the mountain and die. Imagine how unsure and how unworthy, how unfit he must have felt to take the place of a giant like Moses. And imagine how the people must have felt. Moses was the only leader they had ever known in their adult lives. And now someone else, a loyal servant, yes. An understudy, yes. But he was going to take his place, and Moses would not be there to guide him. For many Americans, President Roosevelt was president for so long that they could not imagine government without him. President seemed like his first name. When he died, Harry Truman said to Mrs. Roosevelt, "You have my sympathies." And know you how she answered him? "You have mine." She meant, look who you have to succeed. That's how Joshua must have felt, like Harry Truman, when he had to take over for his master. Joshua had 2 careers within his lifetime. The first part of his life, disciple, servant, devoted to his master. And then for the second half of his life, the leader, the person in charge, the general. The task of being a follower and the task of being a leader are completely 2 different tasks. And they require different skills, different temperaments, different mentalities. Very few human beings are able to do both. To be a good follower and then to be the good leader. Joshua deserves a special place in Jewish history because he could do both, a disciple and a commander. Joshua is not given sufficient appreciation in Jewish history. As I said, his book, which has a list of towns and cities that are conquered, is boring. Its first chapter is the Haftorah on the Shabbat when we finish the Torah and read about the death of Moses. Why? Because the rabbi said, it may be a boring book, but you have to know that Joshua replaced him, carried on the task, and we succeeded. And then the chapter that tells of how the 2 spies from Jericho. This is the two spies. Joshua sends out two spies. Why? Because he knew when Moses sent out 12 was a bad idea. A committee will bring back a donkey, right? It's not going to work. So he sends out two spies and reported that the people of whom they were afraid were really afraid of the Israelites. It's read on the Sabbath that we read the story of the 12 spies. It appears in the liturgy one more time. At the end of the book of Joshua, he gathers the people together and tells them that originally, you know what? Your ancestors, our ancestors were idolaters. But God took Abraham, he brought him across the river, he gave him the land of Canaan. And then he says to the people, choose you this day, in or out. Are you going to be loyal to the covenant, or are you going to drop out now? Choose this day, he says. As for me and my family, we will stay faithful to the Lord. Joshua reminds us that all Jews are Jews by choice. Imagine that. They'd gone through Egypt, they went to Mount Sinai, they crossed through the desert 40 years, and Joshua says, okay, we're about to enter the land of Israel. You want to be part of it or you don't want to be part of it? Choose it. Doesn't matter that you were born into it. The fact is you have to make a choice. His confession that we come from idolaters and should not be arrogant, actually is in the Haggadah. So at least once a year, we hear his voice again. Why is there no holiday to mark the day that led the Israelites across the Jordan? Joshua takes us across the Jordan. We enter the land of Israel. Why isn't there a holiday that says we finally entered the land of Israel? There's no festival to mark the day that he conquered the biblical city. Why is he not given the amount of commentary and legend that other biblical figures get? Why is his book pedantic, detailed, and boring? Perhaps this was the Torah's way of making sure we didn't glorify war or magnify the stature of generals. David was a warrior, but how is he remembered? He's remembered as a psalmist and singer of songs. There is no holy day to mark the entrance into Canaan because the journey still goes on. Every day we're entering the land of Israel. Every day we're protecting the land of Israel. There's no holiday to mark the life of Joshua because we don't celebrate soldiers. Even in a holy cause, even in the holiest cause, few men in history have been able to be both. Great disciples, great leaders, Joshua was. He deserves our respect. Even in a non-militaristic culture such as ours, we have to remember the great general. And this scene in which Moses lets go and in which Joshua takes over is a very poignant one. It speaks to the heart of every one of us who's ever had to go through what Moses went through, to let go of power for the good of the cause or the people or the institution that he has created. It speaks to the heart of everyone who has ever had to take on power, displace their teacher and their guide, who has given them so much. It's one of the most touching scenes in all the Bible. It's a mirror in which fathers who begin hand wrestling with their sons and then let them win reach the day when they are losing, but not by choice, but because the years have taken their toll. Children begin by being totally loyal and dependent and almost worshipful. Then they reach the day they must take hold of the task that their parents can no longer perform. It's a mirror in which all of us can see ourselves. George Washington is lauded as a father of our country for being the general who led us to victory and being the first president. I think he is a father of a country for a much more important reason, and that is he gave up the presidency voluntarily. He refused. Remember, they wanted to appoint him king or at least appoint him life presidency, and he refused because he understood something profound. Democracy is not created by a first election. The first election means nothing. Castro, Chavez, Abbas, and many others won the first election. Democracy is created by the second actual, real democratic election. And George Washington made sure that we had one. He left office and he said, now go have a true election and choose my successor, because I don't get to do it. You have to do it. The greatest miracle of democracy, greatest miracle in America, is that we hand over power every certain number of years through the ballot box without a single shot being fired. That's why January 6th terrified us. Throughout our history, we've had many challenges in courts as to whether this result was legal or those votes were legal. We even had a president declared by the Supreme Court when they handed the election legally, because they are the Supreme Court, to George Bush and ended the counting of the votes. People were upset. No shots were fired. No rebellions. The next election, they would determine if they like it or not. January 6th had violence. We had not experienced that. We have no problem with courts. That's what we do. We sue. We go to court. Court rules. We learn to accept it. We argue. We fight. But we accept it. So January 6th was terrifying because it was a first in our history. The reason we celebrate July 4th in true freedom is because we do hand over power every few years to those duly elected by the people. There were those who asked, how will we survive George Bush? Then they asked, how will we survive Obama? And then there were those who asked, how will we survive Trump? And now there are those who are asking, how will we survive Biden? That's how it goes. And my answer is, how we will survive is very simple. We survived Jimmy Carter, we'll survive anything. Our democracy is strong. Our Constitution is strong. Most of all, the American people is strong. We have many broken things in this country. Don't doubt it. It may be more broken than it's been in our entire lifetime. There are those who would limit people's rights. There are those with autocratic tendencies. We can't come up with a rational and compassionate immigration system. It's broken, and everybody's suffering, including the immigrants. The Constitution says we the people, but we have allowed our leaders to use immigration and other issues in order to divide us rather than to solve problems and ease people's burdens and guarantee people's civil rights. They prefer to use it as a wedge to drive between us rather than to lead and resolve issues. And that's dangerous. It's in their interest not to solve the problem, because then they can use it for political purposes. That's immoral, that's unethical, and it's below the standards of we the people. The greatest crisis we face today is we can't find a Moses and we can't find a Joshua, because they were real leaders who put their people first. We need to hold them accountable and let them know that we want an end to these divisive policies. We want fair and compassionate legal immigration. We want civil rights. We want a fair and compassionate resolution to all these issues. And we want compromise and acknowledgement of people's ideas and beliefs. Where are the Moseses and the Joshuas of today? They are sorely lacking. And when our own time of testing comes to give over control and power to the next generation, may we learn from the example of these two great leaders, and may we be confident that we have given them the tools to preserve the essential values of our tradition in the new world that they will build. This is the meaning of celebrating July 4th, the birthday of this democracy, to preserve it and to be a nation of the people with leaders who believe more in the people than in themselves. Shabbat Shalom.